Okay, hello everyone. So this video is going to be about soil texture, and we're going to be looking at it through settling the soil, because there are three different portions to the layers of soil, and that's going to be sand, silt, and clay. So sand is the biggest particle, then you have silt, and then you have clay. So what's going to happen is we're going to put soil in some water, mix it up, and then it's going to settle. The sand is going to fall first, then the silt, and then the clay. Okay. So this is probably the best to do this because you can use a soil triangle. The texture by feel is great, but it's very subjective. You know, I may feel the texture by feel is a different way than someone else. So that's something that you kind of really want to make sure that you keep in mind when you're doing those labs. So some materials we're going to need. Obviously we're going to need some soil, so this is the soil we collected in the previous video, and so you'll be able to kind of see how that looks. And then we will need some distilled water. Okay, so for distilled water, I mentioned this because we can use the distilled water later, once this settles out, to do some of our chemical tests in another video using the rapid test kit. So that's this one right here, and we'll talk about that for soil chemicals. But distilled water works best, and then you can do this in three ways. So other materials you will need is some sort of a container to hold the soil in, right? So I have here three possibilities. If you have a lab, you can use a graduated cylinder. Glass works best because it is able to see much more clearly. If you use one of those plastic foggy ones, it may not work as well. Then we have just a typical plastic cup, so if you have one of those, you can do that at home. And I also like the mason jar method. Okay, that's a good one too. Now, some of the lab instructions that you find online and in other ask you to add a loom or a lum, and then to add some soap to help the particles settle out better. I honestly have never used that chemical, but I always still get decent results. It's just a matter of how well things were stirred up when you do that. So it's a pretty simple thing. If you're using a cup or a mason jar like these, you don't need to measure halfway or a fourth. You just need to make sure that you put enough soil so that it's covered by the water. Okay? And same thing with the cup. And the graduated cylinder, I tend to use about a fourth to a half of soil, and then the rest with water. The water level does not matter. It's the amount of soil. And even the pre-amount of soil. So like if I measure this out with soil right now, it's not going to matter if I have 50 mLs of soil, 25, or even 10. I mean, that's a very small amount, but you want to make sure that it is visible to you. So that's why I always recommend anywhere between 25 and 50. And definitely use a 100 ml or 50 ml cylinder. Don't go down to a 25 or lower. It's not enough particles, and you're not going to have enough. So, and then of course you'll need a spoon to either put the soil into the container or to stir it up, depending on which one you're using. And if you have it available, a transfer pipette for your soil. So what we're going to do is we'll start with the graduated cylinder, and so we'll get some in there, as I mentioned. So we're going to take some soil, and we're going to put that into our cylinder. Okay, hopefully without spilling too much of it, which I already did. Okay. And you want to make sure you can kind of get as much of the debris away or out as possible. This way you're not going to have too much extra stuff floating in the water or interfering in the layers of your layer settlements. Excuse me. So right there I've added about roughly 40 mLs of soil. Okay, so I don't need to add anything yet, but I will need to add water. Now, more water is better, so I'd like to add about 100. So I'm going to eyeball this for a second and get to about 100. Okay. And so I'm going to stop at about 95 and use my transfer pipette. Okay. And so I take my water and continuously add until I get to about 100. Now, it doesn't really matter. You can also use saran wrap or parafilm to cover the tops of this so you don't have any evaporation. Because the longer you leave this, the better it will settle. But it's not required to have that on. So that's why you like to add more soil, more water. If you only put a small amount above the water, then what's going to happen is you may have some evaporation and layers won't look very well. So this is where it gets a little messy. You have to then cover one end, and you're going to shake up the soil you've got until there's nothing down at the bottom. So if you look right here, I tell my students that if you can do this and nothing sticks and the water looks kind of chocolatey and a little bit messed up like that, then you're okay. So you see how there's nothing staying, that's good. And the trick for this is to make sure you layer it. It gets layered correctly, so you keep on stirring it, and then you'll quickly let it settle, okay? And so I have a napkin over here. What that's going to do is it's going to allow my soil to now settle over the next 24 hours. You want to give this at least 24 hours. When I typically do this lab, we do this on a Friday, and then we let it settle for the weekend. So it will continue to look milky and chocolatey for a while, but what's going to happen is over the next 24 to 48 hours, the layers will begin to settle. So that's with the graduated cylinder, and I will put that aside to let it wait for the next 24 to 48 hours. And then I'll do the same with these two, but I will not be doing the shaking with the cup. With the cup, I'll have to be doing the stirring. So again, we have our soil that we collected, and this again is not a precise science with this. We're just going to make sure that we put about 1/4 of a cup to a half, just like the graduated cylinder. You don't want to, and I've got some roots here, put that out of the way. You don't want to put too much soil because then the water won't work too well. You don't want to put too little because then you may not get all the layers of soil that you need. Okay? So, as you can see, I'm continuously adding, and I'll keep on until we go from there. Okay, and so that's one of the things. So right about there. So that's about 1/4 of the cup. And now at this point, I will do the same thing. I will add some water to it. And this one does not need to be as precise. So as I said, you just pour that in until it's almost twice the layer of where the original soil was. So I'm going to get this to about halfway. And so now it's looking a little milky, but there's still some dry parts of the soil down there. That's where I'm going to use my spoon, and I'm going to stir it and stir it and stir it until there's nothing stuck on the bottom. So you got to tell your kids to make sure that they stir, 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 because if they leave any chunks or muddy parts on the bottom, then you're going to end up with mislayered soil, and that's always the problem. So I mean, you can use the soap or detergent or the alum to do that, but honestly, as long as you do proper stirring, you're good. So I'm feeling some chunks down there. I'm still going to continue to stir. If I need to kind of squash those chunks in the bottom because this came from a moist area, that's pretty easy to do. And so it looks like I'm finally getting it to settle, so I'm going to give it one final big push of stir, and then I can stop. Okay? So now, just like the graduated cylinder, this will begin to layer out. And actually, you'll begin to see, I don't know if you can see on the camera very well, but there's a beginning of a layer right there. So that thicker portion, the stuff that lands first, that's your sand. Then the next layer will be the silt, and what's clouding the water is the clay. So once that actually begins to settle down, you'll go from there. And so even within a few minutes, you'll begin seeing some level of results. So if you look right here on our graduated cylinder, you may not be able to see with the reflection too much, but that spacey portion is your sand, and then it gets smoothed out, and then you get all that cloudiness, that's clay. It's floating in the water. So we need to give the clay time to settle because the particles are so small, okay? And then finally, the mason jar. This is an easy one. If you have some of these, if you're like my household, we always have mason jars sitting around somewhere for some craft project that we're doing. But this is an easy one too. It's very similar to the cylinder in that you'll be able to shake this one up, because if you have a lid to the mason jar, that works out pretty easy. So I'm going to take some of that. I've got some more roots in here. And so you're going to fill that mason jar, again, to about 1/4 to half of soil. And again, you want to make sure that you have as little debris as possible. I've got some more roots. Maybe the same root as earlier. Drop my spoon. Right. And so as you continue to fill that up, you just kind of check the debris as you're going. Because like I said, that debris will get in the way of the layers. and it will begin to float and kind of mess things up. And you'll see that. I'll show you on the graduated cylinder in just a moment. Okay. Continue to do that. And if you've got any hard chunks, if your soil is very dry, it's summer right now, so if you have any hard chunks, do try to break that up before you do this, because it's much more of a challenge to try to do this with a spoon or if you're trying to shake it up. So I'm breaking it down some here. And as you can see, I got about a little less than a fourth. I'll probably put some more in just a second. I'm trying to break down those big chunks, get them out of the way. And you'll pour that in very simply. And you will make sure it's all broken up. Okay, so now we've got our soil, trying to get some of those big chunks kind of broken and out of the way. And they may be a little difficult to break apart too, because sometimes that's the clay that stays in there. Okay? So now I've got this, and just like the others, I will pour some water in, about twice as much water as soil. So we're going to get to about there. Right? And the good thing about the mason jar is you won't have to worry about stirring it so much. You can seal it up, close it off, and hopefully I've sealed that well. We'll see if I spill some in a second. Looks like it's okay, and then you begin to shake. And as you shake it up, just like the graduated cylinder, you make sure there's nothing sticking to the bottom. Right? You make sure there's no big chunks hanging around in there. Very easy, simple thing to do. And when you're ready and you feel like you've mixed it up enough, make sure you settle it down quickly so that you end up with the bright particles layering out properly. So we're going to keep on, and then we're going to lay it flat. Okay? So now I will leave this for the next 24 hours. So this is as it's just finishing. Okay? And then over here, this is our cup, and you're starting to see it, some layering out there. And the clay begins to settle pretty quickly too, and it's still kind of sloshy because it's so small, it's still in the water. So we give this 24 hours for that clay. And by the time we will see this, hopefully by the time I see you guys in our synchronous session, this will be clear at that point, okay? Or in the next video, as I'll probably put it. And then as you can see, our first one that was settling out, there's our graduated cylinder, okay? And so you're seeing that begin to clear out pretty quickly. So the clay is going to fall. It's just going to take some time, okay? And so you put that in a safe place for the next 24 to 48 hours, and by the time you're done, you'll see the layering out. So we'll talk more about that in our face-to-face sessions, but a pretty simple lab, very easy to do, and it comes in handy when you want to do the chemical tests for your soil, because the more soil and water you use, I like to use the mason jar and the cups, because you'll be able to use that water for the chemical tests in your rapid test kits. Okay, and we'll show that in a separate video. Alright? So hopefully that was helpful, and you'll now be able to see how to do the settling lab for particles. So far.